Welcome to Clear the Air with me, Angela Lim, medical doctor and co-founder of Clearhead, an innovative employee wellbeing platform. Clear the Air is a podcast covering those experiences in your life or questions you have that you feel too vulnerable to share with those around you, such as, why do I feel so lonely? And what can I do to feel happier? We get real and raw on these existential questions on mental health and well-being that's puzzled humans for millennia, sharing the science behind what you're experiencing and the answers behind those questions. There are a lot of studies that shows innovation is unlocked when you have a diverse workforce that brings together individuals with unique perspective, knowledge, and experiences. However, we are not equipped with the right tools to foster diversity, equity, and inclusion in the workplace at most times. We risk continuing to disproportionately affect underrepresented communities by failing to construct a safe psychological environment for everyone. In today's webinar, we will speak with Meghna Majmudar from Ready Set to discuss the trials that underrepresented communities face in the workforce and the practical, actionable steps we can take to create a positive experience at work for everyone. Meghna is an experienced anthropologist, strategist, and transformational neuro-linguistic programming practitioner. And through her work, she has learned how to highlight where unfair power imbalances are occurring and propose solutions to help people feel safe in their identities at work. Welcome, Meghna.
Hi, thank you for having me. Excited to be here.
Me too. So before we kick it off, why don't we start with, how you got into the work that you're doing, Meghna?
Yeah, I kind of can't believe sometimes that I get paid to do what I do, but for a long time I was a strategy consultant and coach, and I just started to notice that there's something different happening for people who don't look like the default or the norm. People who were either, immigrants, people of color, underrepresented minorities of some sort. And I just thought, wait, there's something different. Let me kind of explore that. And so I built a whole kind of way of coaching and talking, kind of bringing someone who's had that outsider experience, what's the translation that needs to happen? And so I was doing my work, and then after the murder of George Floyd in the US, summer 2020, there was just a lot of conversation. And so I was in a lot of these conversations, doing a lot of contractual work with the firm I'm at now, Ready Set. And then over time, it just became clear that I should have a full-time job doing this. So that's how I got into it. It was just from my own personal experience of being different in the workplace. And then all of a sudden, there was a moment where people really wanted to dive into that conversation, and I was excited to be having it with folks.
That's great. You spoke a little bit about your minority experience, but maybe you could share more broadly, what does it mean to have a minority experience for people who are not in the minority?
Sure. It's basically someone who feels like, I call it first and onlys. The first from their family or community, or only one like themselves in the room. Somehow you feel different. And so there's been a lot of research, I think, out of Yale and other organizations around this phenomenon called covering, where we try to modulate aspects of how we show up to fit into the larger group. And so, it doesn't just have to be about race or color. There can be a lot of invisible identities of, if someone had difficulty learning or kind of has neuroatypical capabilities, things we can't see. And so just noticing when we feel different, we kind of take some extra processing time to show up. And sometimes that can really get in the way of people feeling like they can be authentic and safe, as you shared, in the workplace.
How would you define the balance between assimilating to a culture versus being authentic with your history and your cultural background, or even in this context, as you said, hidden disabilities as well. So, how would you kind of know whether an individual is in the right spot?
Yeah, I mean, I think it changes over time. It's like if I had the answer to that question, I don't know. I'd be maybe making a lot more money. I don't know. But I think this whole conversation is evolving. I was born in India, and we immigrated to the United States in the 1980s. And back then in America, we were talking about the melting pot. And I think there's been this like, there was this thing of like assimilate and look like everyone else and act like everyone else. But there are things in terms of what my mom packed in my lunchbox that I was always going to be different. And I think all over the world, people have those experiences of there's something about me that makes me different. And kind of when we start to feel like being different is bad or less than. I think when we get into that inferiority or superiority, that's where it starts to get really dangerous. Of like, there's something to be said about I'm a woman. And uh, in the early part of my career, I did think that was bad. Like, there were things I would cover up. I wouldn't talk about certain things in the workplace. But now I'm in a different relationship to what that identity means for me. And so it was really peeling back and saying, like, it's just who I am. This is part of me. I love being in this kind of body and like coming to that. So I think assimilation, if it's coming from a place of there's something wrong with me, that's where it has its most negative impact. But in terms of if you can appreciate I'm different, I think differently than other members on my team. And if you're able to have that conversation, I think that is probably the healthiest dynamic you can have in a workplace.
Yeah, I mean, I often think about it in the context of like the world is such a competitive space, and what makes you unique, what helps you stand out is actually a strength. But you have to work through the first part of the process, which is this innate sense of belonging, because of wanting to belong, because that in prehistorical times when we were evolving means that we don't get killed. But in today's world, being able to be different is what helps set you apart and makes you be more successful and helps the organization also be more successful. I heard you use a term before, which is instead of using the term underrepresented communities, you like to use the term underestimated identities. Did you want to elaborate anything more on that point?
Yeah, I learned it from one of my colleagues, Billy Jackson, of, we have a lot of different histories in the societies we've grown up in, and a lot of these histories excluded people. In America, up until the 1970s, a woman couldn't get a credit card without a father or a husband's signature. And so I'm like, wow, we were excluded from having economic independence. And those exclusions were sometimes just like, oh, they can't handle it. Oh, this person is of this certain race, this person is from this religion or this ethnicity, and so they can't handle it. This is not for them. So there's the underestimation there. And so it's speaking to something that's historical. And now it shows up in the workplace as kind of biases we might have about groups of people.
Do you have common biases that you have seen play out in the workplace?
Oh my God, all of the biases. I know for me personally, I think I have been doing a lot of learning around trans rights, trans experience. That is not a experience of life I know that much about. So I make a special effort to understand in what ways does that impact someone's life and how they go through it. What How might other people respond to them in the work setting? I have a colleague who identifies as non-binary, and just kind of being mindful when others are interacting. So I think the biases always show up as um, we all notice difference. So, there's a way our brains are very naturally set up to notice difference, but it's that when we start coding it as better than or less than for arbitrary reasons, that's where the biases are really negative. And so, and they get reinforced by stories we tell of, oh, a woman can't lift heavy things. That was a bias I heard about on like why there weren't women sales leaders in a medical device firm. And they were like, well, we had this thing where we had to carry around heavy boxes for a long time. And I was like, wow, unexpected that that's how that got set up.
Yeah, and I think as to your point, is a lot of times these biases have gone unchallenged because it was either historical or unconscious. It'd be good for you to kind of share a little bit about some of the work that you've done around how to kind of shed light to unconscious bias so that you can't tackle a problem you can't see. So how do what's the first step in that context?
Yeah, so I think one of the big things that helps people is noticing that like bias just is, it happens. That we don't get to a place of no bias. But the next step after that is understanding we have interpersonal biases, so biases between people. But then there's also bias in our organizations and the societies we live in. And these biases tend to be much more invisible. Like I said, there used to be in this company a rule around being able to lift certain things. And that got connected with a certain type of body and a certain type of identity. Um, and that's how the biases got in. I think a lot of organizations right now think about, in terms of hiring, how are we recruiting? What are the qualifications we ask for? If we're recruiting from certain schools, are we just continuing to embed those biases? And so it's great to ask those questions around that. So, like understanding we all have biases, it's all about being able to interrupt them and then interrupting them either in the interpersonal space of how do I have conversations differently with people, what beliefs do I need to change, and then thinking about things systemically. Are certain people, is it harder for them to get recognized or seen or that sort of thing in our organization? So there are many layers to talking about bias and how to move about it.
Yeah, and I think it's a good segue to kind of understand that we don't exist, the bias have to exist within an environment. And DEI or diversity and inclusion is sort of this buzzword sometimes still. So when we think about the maturity level or the maturity model for different companies in terms of where they are at on their DEI journey, how would you define the common categories that companies would fall under?
Yeah. I think this is such a good question because so many people come in and they're like, my company isn't doing X or we should be doing Y, and they don't know where they are or where they're trying to go. And so I like to think of like a 4 or 5 part maturity model. And I don't know if you talk about this adult learning model of uh, unconscious incompetence, conscious incompetence, conscience competence, and then unconscious competence. So that 4 part. And if you think about it, it's, like early on in that unconscious incompetence, it's just like compliance based. Like we have the bare minimum to cover people according to the law. That we have, and so that's the first stage. And some organizations, they're there. And so the key thing is to try to get to the next step of, okay, so once you get to, okay, we don't do things well, so what can we do differently? Oh, we don't do feedback well. We don't do one-on-ones with managers well. So let's put some training. Let's put some investment in training there. Let's kind of make sure people are equipped to have good conversations about their work performance. And then you can move into conscious competence. Oh, we have a culture of feedback. We have a culture of, transparency. And then the unconscious competence comes. And so I don't know many or any organizations that work with me operating at that level, but the conscious competence is a great place to get to. We have put some processes, systems, mechanisms in place to really make sure everyone feels like they can do their best, that their work is valued, and they're part of the conversation.
Yeah, I mean, I don't really work as much in the space as you do, but a part of me feels like unconscious competence is when anyone in the company can look at when something's not right, it doesn't align with our values, it doesn't align with our processes. Hey, anyone can call it out, even if it's the receptionist, it doesn't have to be a leader and manager. That's when it's like permeated into the organization and it becomes an unconscious competence that anyone in the company can lean on. I'd like to maybe go a little bit deeper around that point you made about giving feedback. So, especially, I've spent time in the US and I was there actually during the 2016 election for Trump, and things got very tricky in terms of, even just identifying either as a Republican or a Democrat. Families were breaking up because of this. And even post George Floyd, we're starting to see more and more of this, in some ways, hesitancy to have conversation because people are fearful that they'll say the wrong thing. So yeah, be good to kind of maybe get some advice or tips and tricks that you've seen work when providing feedback that is culturally responsive or appropriate in the context of a minority individual.
Yeah, I mean, I think so. I have to admit, I did not have a good relationship with feedback for most of my career. It's only in the last 2 or 3 years that I've become kind of like, yes, feedback, it's amazing. Because growing up in an immigrant family, feedback was just criticism. It was just the sort of like, you didn't get the A+. You're not doing good enough. You're not doing well enough. That's how it was heard, how I heard it as a child, and that continued. And so, so for me, in the early part of my career, when the kind of like trainers or the HR leaders would get up there and it's like, feedback is a gift, I thought someone was making a joke, like on me, of like, feedback is not a gift. It is absolutely not. And because I was in work environments where it was used very politically, it was used to keep people under control, or make them feel bad about themselves so that people in power could stay in control. I'm seeing lots of hands getting thrown around. um, and so I had just seen it done really badly. And then it wasn't until I started working at Ready Set where I saw feedback being done well, where it was actually, I need to tell you something because I want you to be better at what you do. And so my manager, the first one-on-one I had with her, she asked me, "How do you like to get feedback?" And I told her, "I don't." And she like laughed and she's like, "But seriously, I am going to give you feedback. How would you like to receive it when I have to give you feedback?" And I was like, "Well, now that you're pushing it, because of the experiences I've had, I need you to do it one-on-one in private, especially if it is constructive or negative feedback. And I need you to give it to me very softly, and talk about the impact and really work with me on like what needs to be different, and kind of be ready to be in a conversation, because you can't just do the seagull feedback of like fly over, give me the feedback, poop all over me, and then fly away, which is sometimes how feedback is given. So, so, so she was like, great. And then she said, this is how I like to give feedback, how I like to get feedback. And that was such a powerful signal that I could give feedback upwards. So there was so much permission setting around all of that. And then so I copied that. And I had so I like to get feedback like in like verbally and over video or in person. But I had a direct report who had some, kind of neuroatypical kind of things, and she said, "I need feedback written down. I need you to like write it in a document, send it to me on Slack, so that I can have time to process it, and then come back to you with questions." And I was like, "Okay." And so just asking can kind of like reduce the temperature. And I think a lot of times, especially when someone has a social identity that's different from yours, like you don't want to come across as sexist or racist or homophobic or any of the things, right? And so it's just like, I'm not going to share the feedback, or I don't kind of share it in the clear terms. And this is where you get those cultures of being too nice a little bit. And here I have found it really helpful to have a model for giving feedback of, I like from the Center for Creative Leadership, their SBI model of what's the situation, what's the behavior I observed, what was the impact of that behavior? And then I'd like to add a C of what's the change I'd like to see. So I think really, especially, and there are a lot of studies out there that show that women and people of color do not get as useful feedback. And if feedback is how people get better at their jobs, this is maybe a reason why people aren't getting promoted. They're not getting the feedback. They're not getting the like, oh, I need to do things differently. And so if you're able to really focus on the behaviors and the impact and work with people on the change, that can help.
Yeah, and I think that, sometimes it feels easier to just um, generically say, oh, this is how I deal with women. This is how I deal with Asians. This is how I deal with people with autism. Like it's actually ultimately we're all individuals, and we jokingly said, like, for example, some of me and my friends are bananas. You were yellow on the outside, white on the inside. And so things like that means that you it's not helpful sometimes also to just generically apply what's superficially on the surface. And as we keep saying, a lot of times diversity is hidden. And the best thing you can do is take the time to just sit down one on one and say, for this unique individual, how do they want to receive feedback? And obviously, feedback is an action step, but there are a lot of things in which an organization does that if you can take the time to individualize as much as possible. And to be honest, a lot of the trends of what employees' expectation is around that personalization, that individualization. And so being able to do that is really important. Along those contexts, I think it's really important to kind of share around, some of the comments that you mentioned before, Meghna, which is, what it means to be too nice. Can you share, how does that manifest, and how can that actually turn into more passive aggressiveness that is actually unhelpful for anyone in that environment?
Yeah, Angela, I think you said it. There's a passive aggressive quality to it. There's a dissonance of you're saying nice things, you're saying positive things, but the way I read your body language, the way I read the nonverbal, there's something you're not saying. I see tension, I see something else. There's a dissonance. And so it's very confusing to someone when it's the passive aggressive and you're like, okay. I live in California, and so in the U.S. it's known as a more passive aggressive area, especially the Bay Area, Northern California, where I live. But I grew up on the East Coast, and I've lived in Boston and New York, and it's much more direct. It's much more aggressive. And so there's a way aggressive feels, right? Like just like I'm gonna tell you, and it's just like, oh, that didn't feel great, but okay, I know where you are. Passive aggressive is like it's like you're looking behind your back, right? It's like you don't feel safe. And I think it comes from like feeling like you can't say things, you can't be yourself, you can't be honest. And so just noticing what in the environment may be contributing to that. Could it be the leader or manager style? Could it be like a certain team dynamic? You know, like I've worked for managers who tended to get really angry and shout in the workplace. I know it feels weird to say that because I don't think that kind of behavior is tolerated anymore. But early in my career, it was. And so, like, kind of, like, I remember there was one client where the sales team had an open space office, and the men would just throw a football around. And so a lot of people, especially women, did not feel safe because there was always a football near their head. So I think like not saying stuff because like it's not okay to say stuff. That's what like when people feel like they cannot say something, and if they say something, there will be a negative consequence. There will be retaliation. That's when we get into the psychological danger. This is a dangerous work environment.
I will say that most companies have a version of that, even if it's not the whole company, but maybe just the department or the team. Let's just say, our listeners are in those situations. How can they change it? Is it possible for an individual employee to do this, or is it only can be done from the top?
Yeah, I think it's a both and. The first step is personally, can you name it? You know, I know for me, I am supported by a phenomenal therapist, and there are things that come up in my conversations with her that I don't know that I can name necessarily at the workplace. But being able to name it privately, like even in my journal or with my community, that keeps me connected to myself. And then I can make a decision on whether or not I want to, um, talk about it. So at Ready Set, we have this framework that we call ROPA, and so the ROPA stands for risk. What's the risk if I don't say anything? What's the risk if this continues happening? So understanding the risk of like, hey, this person kind of just gives unsolicited advice. What's the risk? Um, they're just annoying. So it's not that risk. So I think it's just a personal risk. Or it's just like he only does it with women of color. So I think there's a risk that, like he might get reported to HR if this keeps continuing. What's the opportunity? So the O is opportunity. What's the opportunity I have to live my values, to, create the kind of culture I want? What's the opportunity here? Of like, hey, I have a tough time being direct, so I'm going to take an opportunity to be more direct with this person one on one. Who's empowered to act? And I think this gets to your question, Angela, of is this something I can do by myself, or do I need to bring someone else in? Do I need to talk to a manager? Do I need to escalate this? It's like thinking about who actually can make a difference here. And then the A is the action of like, okay, I'm going to go talk to that person, or I'm going to deal with this directly. And so hopefully just being able to ask a set of questions will help people navigate because each context is different.
That sounds great, and we love having sort of frameworks that people can sort of apply, because sometimes it just feels very amorphous. And if you just take step by step, you can analyze things either at a situational level or at an organizational level when you start to see similar patterns of behaviors, whether by one single individual or just the culture itself. And, are there other generic guidelines for diversity and inclusion at an organization level that you've found helpful for people to kind of apply, especially for people with like different identities or culture, just to kind of really, maintain that inclusive and healthy work environment?
Yeah, I mean, I think so. I do a lot of trainings where I talk about what most organizations get wrong about diversity, equity, and inclusion. And so I'll share that. And by, I think, talking about what they get wrong, it starts to like point the direction towards what can people maybe experiment and try to do differently.
Yeah, that sounds good. And often we think about like, oh, I don't want to be like my mom because she did X, Y, Z. And so you try and model what it means to be a mom differently. Or same thing, like, I don't want to be this type of manager because this is what I experienced the last time and it was terrible. And so, yeah, it can also be a very helpful tool.
Yeah, and then you become the manager and you're like, oh, this is why they did that. Okay. Yeah, like I'm seeing a lot of why my mom did what she did. so, um, so, um, so a couple of things that I tend to see. So diversity, equity, and inclusion, they mean three different things. So diversity tends to be about kind of, for better or for worse, like what do people look like? But it's really meant to be what unique perspectives do we bring? What kind of experiences does our team bring? Equity is about the systemic issues and processes that have excluded people, making sure that there's fairness in all the systems and processes and, how people get promoted, how they get paid, all of that. Inclusion is about, I like to define it as shared power. Do people feel like they're part of decision making? If they're not part of decisions, do they feel represented in whoever was making the decision? Do they agree with the values or criteria used to make the decision? There's a sharing of power there. So I kind of define those terms because a lot of organizations will just focus on the D, like the diversity, and just like, we got to get our numbers. And it's just like, but people don't feel heard or listened to. Yes, right. It's tokenizing. Or it's all about inclusion of like, we're all in this together. It's like democratized, like, everything is a consensus. And then people don't feel like they can share their unique perspective. They don't think they can ask those questions. Like the studies say of like, actually diverse teams are able to talk and go back and forth. I see someone is asking, what does the P stand for in ROPA? Power. Who is empowered to act? So that's one thing. They focus on the D or the I, and no one's really thinking about the equity. And so there's that. They can focus just on the hiring part of the employee life cycle and not what are our cultural norms? If you're in the office, who cleans up after a meeting? Or, in meetings, who's asked to take notes? Does it just fall to the junior person? Does it just fall to, say, the woman on the team? That sort of thing. So the cultural norms of an organization are part of DEI work. A lot of organizations for that will just think about ERGs and not about the day-to-day experience. Then there's the feedback and mentorship, like how do people get promoted? I've worked with a number of organizations that have done studies that show that actually women and people of color took longer to get promoted, even though they had the same skill sets and this and that. And they're like, what is that about? And they built a sponsorship program to really change that dynamic in their organization. So it's like focusing on the employee life cycle beyond hiring and onboarding. And then there's a lot of people talk about there isn't representation at senior levels. And so kind of like being open about the conversation there too can help. And so that's what organizations are struggling with. And so in terms of effective DEI action, it's really focusing on the like, what can we do? What's the environment we want to build?
Yeah, and I think it's so important to recognize that, it's again, there are different steps that you have to take and being very intentional about which problem you're trying to solve, rather than again just this blanket, we're doing DEI, but actually just like which part of DEI are you working on right now? And maybe, there's not much issue with the D part, and you actually should focus more on the equity part, because generally that's the hardest bit when you have to make systemic changes, to be honest.
Yeah, and one thing I forgot to mention, I'm like, I can't believe this because I say this all the time, is a lot of organizations treat business goals and DEI goals as like completely separate and at odds with each other. Oh, we don't have time to do DEI. We got to focus on meeting our results by the end of the quarter. And it's actually like, if we include people's perspectives, we can actually get to the answer faster. Maybe we might figure out a different way to do it. And so I think really figuring out how does investing in diversity, equity, and inclusion help us meet our business goals. Asking that question is really important too.
And one of the things I have seen actually is, you know, sometimes there are the people, these individual minorities that are brave enough to speak up, and they see something that's not going right and they'll say something about it. But I see it falling into two camps. One is that they speak up and then they get ignored because they don't have power in the organization. Or the other is like, they are the one person in the group, in the company that is of that minority, or the, one or two people. And so then they are either the one that's always overly relied on. So anything to do with indigenous affairs, let's speak to this individual about it. And so they become incredibly exhausted because they're always the one banging on about the same stuff again and again. And so, yeah, how do you deal with that? Especially, I think we see it more prominently in sort of the indigenous cultures, and in New Zealand, that's sort of the Maori population.
Yeah, I think it's asking yourself. So we at Ready Set talk about this idea of allyship, and I don't know how frequently that term is used outside of the U.S., but there's this idea of, at Ready Set we define it as it's a lifelong process of building relationships with people. And so, and in the US, there was, especially in the wake of George Floyd, there was a lot of performative allyship of people putting it on their socials, but not really becoming part of the movement. And, really understanding what is it that people are fighting for. And so what is the common purpose? And so I think, it's connecting with and focusing on who is impacted and going there and supporting them. Of like, if you see, like, say, someone get interrupted in a meeting, after the meeting, going to them and saying, hey, I saw something. Do you want me to say something? Do you have this? Like, that sort of thing. I think, like, really focusing on who was impacted and, the willingness to step in. And I think it's like being able to okay, is this, like, what is the impact of this kind of behavior?
Yeah, and it's so important because ultimately, it's being able to, one, clearly communicate how this affects you as the minority, or how it affects other people in the organization. And often actually, the research have shown that if you do the right thing for minorities, it's not just the minority that benefits. Everybody benefits from a better process that is more inclusive for others, or might be a different way of thinking that is actually challenging a norm that was maybe not working for as many people as we might assume to be. It's really interesting to also, I think, recognize that there is this bystander effect. And we sort of covered this a little bit when we were doing our podcast episode on bullying. And that actually, when you are the individual that is trying to put your hands up and say, hey, something's not right, can we change this because it's impacting me or others in this way, is if you don't feel you're in a position of power to influence in the organization, really taking the time to build relationships with other people on one-on-one. So and there's this really interesting story where there was this man that was very racist. Like he's like someone famous. I can't remember his name. He was known to be racist, but he actually provided, I think, scholarship to two black men that he worked with, and so it was almost like a dissonant. Wait, this person is like publicly racist about like African American, and yet he paid for this person's tuition for college. Like, why? And it's because people, when they think about it in a group setting, they disassociate themselves. But when they know you as an individual, they are more likely to actually then act on it because it feels personal. Like, oh, I know this person, and not just like, oh, it's those Mexicans trying to cross the border and take over all my jobs. So as much as you can, when you're trying to be effective, find those who are allies in power, do it on a one-to-one basis. It might take longer, but it will be more effective because people respond to individual stories and personal relationships than they do generic statistics.
Yeah, and I think like that can sometimes feel very frustrating for folks of like, I want big change right now. And it's actually like all of humanity has ever moved forward in those one-to-one relationships. And that's how you build solidarity. That's how you build community. And that's how you move forward, of being kind of at common cause with each other. Because when you hear each other's stories, when you understand the life experiences, the person gets humanized. It's easy to be an ist or phobic when you can dehumanize, when you can just wave a wand. But when you see the other humanity, I think most people, especially if they're showing up to a conversation like this, see humanity. I see that someone has put into a question of, for invisible underrepresented groups, having to declare the identity to be considered for feedback input, because people jump to the assumption that there's no one from that group to speak. Yeah, this is a really fascinating question. I mean, at least in the US, I don't know what laws are like outside of the US of, you if you disclose certain things to your manager, they have to go through a process of accommodations. And so there was, for me, the person kind of named they had a diagnosis of something, and so I had to work with my HR professional and kind of work through accommodations for the person. I think that's just the kind of workplace I am in. But I think what this questioner is asking is, I've shared something about myself, and now people jump in thinking that they know about it. And I think it's noticing, this is the kind of dark side of allyship, of like noticing the saviorism that people can feel, or like the kind of like, let me step in, because I have also stepped in it myself, and I've had people like tell me like, don't do that again. And so I think like to the extent possible, creating kind of, like you said, the relationships, but also kind of consent. Like I mentioned my colleague who identifies as non-binary. Someone used the wrong pronouns with them and on an email chain. And I just did a quick Slack, hey, do you want me to say something or do you have this? And they were like, I got this. That sort of thing. So I think there needs to be a conversation about like jumping in or not, or why are people doing that? Like, do they want to be like, is it a virtue signal, as they say? Or is this really about, hey, like if we don't make this kind of accommodation in our product or service, we're going to lose out on a big kind of customer need type of thing. So it's kind of like what are people actually trying to talk about?
In terms of like, actionable steps that any organization can take in the context of all the discussion we've had so far, is there any other, sort of tips and tricks that you have learned and taught other organizations that you felt we haven't spoken about yet?
Yeah, I mean, I think really it's a focus on communication skills. It is a focus on what are the values that really set our culture apart. How do we show up living these values? And I don't think organizations talk about these things. And so, like, to what extent can, say, leaders kind of use it in their communications, be values driven in how they talk about what comes next or why they're doing a certain strategy? How are managers trained in their one-to-ones to give feedback? Like what are meeting norms to make sure everyone's included, or if someone's been quiet, they're invited into the conversation in a non-threatening way. Things like that. How aligned is the HR team in terms of having all the processes set up? So there are so many different places to start. And like we talked about earlier, of like getting clear on where are we in the maturity model. And you can want the like, I want X, but if you're starting at stage 1, what would it take to get to stage 2? So kind of chunking it down of like, how do I get to that next stage?
Yeah, I think it's really important to remember that if you're part of an organization where you've done all these things and you've seen that feedback has been provided and the organization's not taking it on, no changes coming, it's okay, and you're not a failure to self-select out of that culture as well. It's not worth your mental health to kind of stay in, to constantly bang on about like, hey, this is negatively impacting me or people like me, and not see change. And I think a lot of that, as you said, is being transparent from the organization and leaders' perspective around what is our culture and what is our values. Because for some people, working 80 hours a week under someone like Elon Musk to get rockets to space is something that they're going to self-select on, and that and as long as the organization is super transparent that, look, it's an 80-hour week minimum, and if that's not aligned with what your needs are, whatever cultural background or personal identification you have, then actually it's totally okay to be like, actually, I don't want to join this organization, and I'm going to join the other organization that is better aligned with my values or my cultural needs or my diverse expectations. So I think just wanted to really flag that it's, if you've tried and it's still not right, it's okay to leave. The other thing as well, and we spoke briefly about it earlier, is if the person you're struggling with is someone in power and there's that level of conflict and you don't know how to, as a person who's less in power or a minority in the organization, it's totally okay for you to reach out for help. Meghna, you mentioned you saw a therapist, and yeah, most organizations have an EAP program. Clearhead is one of them, and so we've supported many employees to be matched up to a professional to help them deal with conflict management or, bullying or a lack of belonging. So yeah, so start with getting a bit more help. Professional help is available in most organizations. Do your bit to kind of raise the feedback, build those allyship relationships, and if it's still not working, it's totally okay to opt out.
Yeah, yeah. And I think the only thing I'd add to that is, financially, someone may not be able to opt out. And that is really where kind of the personal boundary work is very important of I need to keep this job, to keep benefits, to keep paying the bills, keep the roof over the head, and like making sure you have support outside so that there's a way to recover from that. So that you do have that little extra energy to maybe apply or kind of for a different type of job or that sort of thing. So like yes, love that like the permissioning of you if it's not safe for you, there is kind of like a final stage, and if you are further constrained, just make sure that there's some support outside of work that can help remind you of who you are. And so because it's so easy to get lost in this work too.
Yeah, and we haven't really touched on this, but I think it's really important. One of the increasing tension we see in our companies that we serve is the tension of diversity in the context of generations. So there is now increasingly conflict, I guess, in terms of generational difference on how things get done in the workplace. Can you share any insights from that perspective and how to navigate that?
Yeah, I mean, I think so. I have an exercise I like to do where I ask people to identify which generation they identify with, and then ask about what were like the key news events or cultural moments when you were in grade school. So for the boomers, it was either in America, it was JFK assassination or the man landing on the moon. For Gen X, it was seeing the Challenger rocket explosion and just like, oh my God, that happened. For millennials in America, it was watching the Twin Towers fall down. And for Gen Z in America, it was a lot of school shootings. And so that those types of events create how safe you feel in the world. So like so having people kind of use that of like, oh, yeah, if I was 10 and I saw the Twin Towers fall down, I did think differently about work and that sort of thing. So, like you said, it is about opening up a different kind of conversation in the workplace, um, and um, and what does that mean in terms of our values? What do we value? And so I think what complicates this is now there's so much remote work or hybrid work, and people do not know how to communicate effectively for hybrid work. And so the generational differences are further exacerbated. So it comes back to, okay, so what are the values we can align on, whichever generation we're a part of? And what are the communication skills we need to work this in a hybrid work environment? Which, so you have to have a very different way of teaching and learning because you're not in person the same way.
This topic is heavy in the context that we've talked a lot about what it means to be an other that's not in power, an other that doesn't have influence, an other that is just being done to. We've obviously talked a lot about giving people tips and tricks both at an individual level and an organizational level to really create a much more safe workplace psychologically and be more inclusive. But let's end on a positive note around, when you've worked with companies who have implemented these things, what does that success look like? What have you seen as like success stories?
I mean, the success stories is just kind of like, OMG, we're doing it. And I think people maybe don't take their wins. They tend to be so humble, so modest. And it's just like, well, there's just so much more work to do. But I'm like, yeah, but it's better than it's ever been. And so I think for me, I think each organization comes in with a different context, but I think it's the confidence of we saw something, we put some energy behind it, we created a change, and we did it. And now we can move forward and continue to make positive changes. So I think it's that just that cumulative of like step by step, and when they take time to step back and it's just like, wow, we actually have made a difference. So I think it's pretty subtle and ephemeral, but like it just shows up as people just being having better team relationships and like wanting to go into work and feeling that they're part of something really important and exciting, and there's something to kind of move through the world with.
Yeah, look, it's the world is in a difficult spot right now, and you'd be surprised how many people are relying on work as their safe solace. And as much as we can create that for people, how powerful is that in terms of meaning that we can do? We always end these sessions with one question, which is, what is your one well-being practice, Meghna, that you do to stay well?
Right now, it is actually just the physical fitness of going to the gym and like having that time for myself, put some music in, and just kind of breathe and take it slow. That's what's getting me through this moment right now. But also my therapist.
That's it for today's episode. If you want to learn more about how Clearhead can support your workplace, or you have a burning mental health question that you'd like us to explore on the podcast, check us out at myclearhead.com and drop us a message. Love our content? Share it with a friend or leave us a comment on LinkedIn, Instagram, or Facebook. Thank you so much again for listening, and catch you on the next one.